That's got that done. Our first speaker this afternoon is Boris Frankel, who's a political economist, social theorist and a cultural critic. He is Principal Honorary Fellow at the Institute for Sustainability at the University of Melbourne. He is a prolific writer and author. His latest book, Fictions of Sustainability, is here today. He's selling them at one-off green special price of $20. So you can get copies at the end of this. I'm sure some of you will want to do that. I first came across Boris when he published a book called From Prophets, Deserts Come, which was about neoliberal theorists and so on back many, many years ago, late 70s, early 80s. And the titles of his books have always been much more catchy than Fictions of Sustainability, and some of them are mentioned in the program, as you would have seen, like Zombies, Lilliputians and Sadists, The Power of the Living Dead and the Future of Australia. And I don't know whether he's going to take those things up this afternoon, but without further ado, I'll hand you over to Boris Frankel.
I don't know whether I should... Is it easier to stand, or do you mind if I sit, or what do you want me to do? Right? Okay. Look, I've only got 10 or so minutes, so let's get the show rolling. The Green New Deal has been around for about 30 years under different names. It's come to prominence in the last few years through the Americans, AOC, and in Europe, and also now in Australia. What I would like to talk about are some of the differences between the Green New Deal, because the title itself doesn't really tell us a great deal, apart from the fact that it originated as a variation, in America that is, of Roosevelt's New Deal. Now, if we think of Roosevelt's New Deal, it was there's a great deal of romanticisation about Roosevelt and the 30s. In fact, it was not a very radical program at all. It was mainly a risk-averse program. And the current New Deal that's proposed by the Left Democrats is, in some ways, an attempt to rectify what was unleft or unfinished by the New Deal generation. So if you look at their program, you've got things such as a universal health care, paid holidays, can you imagine? Paid holidays for workers, childcare, various things wrapped around a general Keynesian type of growth program. And of course, within the American context, this is a very radical agenda. And they're bitterly attacked by the right, because even the ability to legislate for what are essentially social democratic proposals within an environmental agenda is something that is quite different to the European New Deal, the Green New Deal. And there, the Green New Deal is really, because they have a healthcare system in most of the EU countries, and they have a range of other social welfare programs, even though the neoliberals have attacked them for the last 3 decades. But they're certainly more extensive than in the United States. And there the debate is different. The debate is, how do you fund a Green New Deal? And the debate there, as some of you may or may not know, is between whether you fund it through taxes, and that is the proposal coming from Thomas Piketty and a group of others, or whether you fund it through increased debt, which is the proposal from Yanis Varoufakis and the Democracy in Europe 2025 group. So they are quite significant, in a sense, proposals that aim for similar things, but are much more refined than the debates in America or the debates in Australia, as far as I haven't really seen a great deal of debate about the Green New Deal in Australia, apart from the Greens, that is you people here. And I'm going to say a few words about the Green proposals, and I'm going to address specifically how the Greens propose to fund their proposals that they took to the last federal election. Now, in that proposal, and I'm not sure whether New South Wales Greens were responsible for that program or not, but I'm going to make comments in regard to the national program. Because the problem in Australia is that we have an economy that, and it's worth reminding you all about this, that is essentially one of the most lopsided economies in the world. We have less than 4.5% of the workforce working in the mining, that is rocks and crops, which accounts for 70% of our agriculture, and the vast bulk of people who work in the urban centres of Australia work in 6 or so industries. I mean, they work in many industries, but the 6 leading ones are health and recreation, retailing, education, manufacturing, which has decreased dramatically over the last 20 years, and finance sector, and a few other things like that. And when you're talking about a Green New Deal, you've got to talk about what kind of economy you want, because we've got a federal system, and if most of the people in WA and Queensland account for our exports of, especially the minerals, and you've got revenue generated in the urban centres, you've also got a lopsided internal economy, where New South Wales and Victoria are essentially generating the manufactured and services that are then exported across to WA, Tasmania, South Australia and Queensland. So any Green New Deal in Australia must take into account how you reorganise an economy which is already so lopsided. And if you also talk about the revenue, the last proposal from the Greens at the last federal election contained many good points in it, but it also contained essentially a list of wish lists. It was a wish list. And if I added up all the costing of all the proposals in the last Green federal platform, and it came to 115.9 billion. And that was made up of what you could get from taxing multinationals, closing down subsidies that are fossil fuel, also forcing companies to pay for the environmental damage, and also closing the tax loopholes. They were some of the key proposals. There were a few other things like that. And also the key part of the Green New Deal, not called that in the election manifesto, was how do you reduce greenhouse gases by 2030? Now you've got this pincer movement which doesn't add up. And I'm talking about the pincer movement where you're wanting to close all the tax loopholes and derive revenue, and you're calculating the revenue that's coming from multinationals, and at the same time you want to reduce carbon emissions. So simultaneously you've got a 10-year window to dramatically reduce carbon emissions, but at the same time fund your alternative necessary housing, health, education and all other type of programs, which in their own right are absolutely essential, but it doesn't add up. And why doesn't it add up? And that's because if we just take exports of coal and gas, 57 billion from, this is about a year and a half old, these figures, but we haven't got the latest figures for 2019. 57 billion was earned in revenue from coal, and 26 billion from gas, and gas is increasing. Now that adds up to approximately 85 billion out of your 116 billion expenditure. So you've already knocked out 3/4 of your revenue that is going to be necessary to fund your Green New Deal. Now, of course, you can get other revenue things, but you haven't there is a real problem in the Greens program about how do you move to the next stage without... it's easy to focus on what we call the big end of town, and it's popular to tax multinationals, and I'm all for it, no question about that. But you have to be able to show a more transitional program where you've got a government, and let's face it, short of revolution, the only possible viable government in Australia is a coalition government between the ALP and the Greens and others. Otherwise, we're just talking fantasy. Because the Greens, as we know, maybe in the next world or next life will become a government in their own right, but at the moment depend on some form of ALP. Now, leaving aside the hopelessness of the ALP in terms of policies, but you've got to be able to spell out in more detail what you're offering the public. You've got to be able to spell out in more detail what kind of employment sectors are going to be generated. It's not enough for the Greens to say in their manifesto, we are the party of small business. My goodness, this is an absolutely anti-environmental position to stand on, because of course we need small business, but we can't do a blanket kind of endorsement of small business, because most businesses in Australia are small business. And most businesses in Australia pay a very hefty and substantial role in tax avoidance, not paying their workers a super, and contributing to unsustainable consumption and production. So you have to be able to be more specific about what kind of small businesses the Greens will support and which ones you would not like the party to support. I know that's controversial, but if you want to really not aim just to be in government, but you want to really change the agenda, you've got to get people to think about what type of policies are going to move to the next step. So my argument really would be, yes, a Green New Deal is essentially a green growth agenda. It's not a radical degrowth or sustainable economically sustainable agenda, but you can't just leap. You have to at least go through various stages. And if you want to think seriously about how you build and change the public agenda, you have to really do the detailed work. And it's not just true of the Greens, it's true of most parties around the country and in other countries. The detailed analysis of housing, what kind of manufacturing, what kind of services we want, where are the people going to come if you want green infrastructure. You've got to distinguish between, it's no good having a general thing, we can generate 189,000 jobs or something in green jobs. But you have to distinguish in more precise details the temporary green jobs that will be coming from retrofitting or various things from the ongoing jobs. Because as our Member of Parliament will tell you, there's a difference between recurrent expenditure and capital expenditure. And no budget will last more than a year. And a lot of the tax revenue that's in the Green Federal Program is really a one-off. After you've closed the loopholes and that, a certain amount will be flowing into the coffers each year, but a lot of it will not. And so you can't just calculate on a year. Any Green New Deal must be implemented over at least a minimum of 3 elections. And to be able to sustain the popularity of your party or coalition, you can't avoid the harsh facts. There are only 2 countries in the world at the moment that can secure their currency and fend off a foreign capital. That's the US and China. Australia can't do it. Australia has one of the most heavily traded currencies in the world because it's linked to the commodity sector. And the commodity sector is a bellwether as to whether there's going to be a downturn or an upturn. And so our currency is linked to it. Now, any government coming into office and puts forward a Green New Deal agenda must have terrific support locally to withstand the pressure from businesses and governments abroad. Because there will be external pressure coming to, in a sense, first of all, there'll be a sell-off of the dollar. Now, Australia cannot, at the moment, create its own necessary imports. Produce its own goods that are mainly imported. That is the elaborately processed goods. You would have a collapse of the economy if all the IT and electronics, etc., were not able to be produced here. You can produce them here, but we can't even produce chalk here at the moment. We can't, a lot of our food's imported. A lot of our essential items, especially the heavy items like cars and all the rest, that are not necessary. They are adding to our bill. So we've got the possibility of changing the composition of what we make and buy, but no Green New Deal will succeed unless you can sell to the public the necessity of having to scale down forms of consumption. Because your import bill will still remain massively high, and there is very little to be able to pay for it, apart from rocks and crops. And of course foreign students and the tourists. But once you start upsetting China and you're not exporting your rocks and crops to China, and they don't have an interest in sending their large number of students here, as Hall said, it's time to wind up the doom and gloom and get on to the real new Green Deal. So let's do the detailed work. Let's not feel pessimistic. I'm personally quite an optimist about all of these issues, providing that people move from the level of wish lists to the detailed work that has to be done. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Boris, for that injection. Our next speaker is Petra Stott, who's now with the Climate Works in Melbourne, previously with the Climate Council, and her area of special expertise and interest is the transition to zero emissions by 2050. So to make her welcome, Petra.
Thank you. I'm going to start by making a really embarrassing admission. I've worked in climate change for 16 years, and the first time I started hearing the phrase Green New Deal about 2 years ago, I was just quietly thinking to myself, what is this? And I did a bit more digging because to me it just sounded a bit sort of maybe a bit American. I don't know much about the New Deal. I had a little bit of an idea what it might be. But then when I looked into it, I found that it's at its most basic addressing climate change and social inequality and making a good society at the same time together. And I think that that's a pretty important idea. But putting my climate communication hat on from the Climate Council, I think that we might need a term for it in Australia that is makes a bit more sense here, that doesn't link back to an American idea, and is something that you can understand the first time you hear it. The second thing I want to say is it is really important and really important right now. The place where I work, you might have noticed if you read the media, with the lack of federal government action on climate change, we're starting to see a real trend of big corporations stepping up and taking action. More than 190 major corporations like Facebook, Google, Coca-Cola, some of our big banks, Westpac and Commonwealth, are all committing to be 100% renewable. So there's this real wave and trend of corporate action on climate change and very big corporations taking the lead. Obviously that's good in terms of climate change. I'm definitely not going to say that's a bad thing, but it does give me pause for thought, because if I think about those companies, I don't necessarily think they're going to deliver. They might act on climate change, they might transition their businesses to renewable energy. All those things are great, but I'm not convinced they're going to deliver a good outcome for all of us and for society as a whole. And I think we've already started to see that play out in the electricity space. So we know we can have low-cost renewable energy that provides 24/7 power. We know that renewable energy is generating power into the grid, sometimes at zero cost, but our electricity prices continue to go up. So there are other reasons for why we're not seeing the benefits of that transition. But I think we've talked a lot about energy in Australia in the past couple of years. So today, in terms of making it tangible, what a Green New Deal might look like, called something else, I wanted to talk about an issue that I'm really passionate about, which is sustainable transport. So just a few facts and stats, because that's what climate people like me like to do. So we know transport makes up 19% of Australia's emissions. It's vying for second place in terms of being the biggest polluter with stationary energy sources. It's a pretty significant greenhouse gas emitter, and it's the sector which has seen the greatest rise in greenhouse gas emissions across all the different sectors, from electricity, stationary energy, agriculture. And if you look at it on a graph, it's just steadily increasing over time. And the reason for that is that we just keep doing the same thing over time with more and more, obviously with more and more people living in our cities, but the basic underlying factors for why transport is so high emitting stay the same, which is our cars are very polluting, we don't have public transport systems that provide high quality public transport to the outer suburbs, so people often don't have an alternative. And our governments spend something like 80% of the government spending that goes into transport infrastructure goes into roads, and only 20% goes into rail. So we have this issue that compounds over time. And I guess, why is this relevant to this topic? Well, that system of transport, I think we all know, isn't working for us. We know people driving in their cars aren't enjoying it. It's stressful, it's isolating, it's time away from their kids and their families. It's really expensive. So we talk about electricity prices in Australia, but transport as a section of our household spending is something like 5 times what we spend on electricity and gas, yet we so rarely talk about it. And we know that building more roads means basically more land for cars and less for housing, for open space and all those good things we love about living in the city. And we also know all the negative environmental air pollution effects of relying on petrol and diesel vehicles to get around. So air pollution in our cities, noise, people who live on bus routes or use buses will know, that particular diesel kind of smell that you get. And often particularly bad effects for schools and childcare and open space, which are often located close to big highways. But on the positive side, state and federal governments are about to spend something like tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars on new transport infrastructure in this country. And they're doing that to tackle rising populations in our cities, but also to help sort of boost the economy. So that money is going to be spent anyway. What I would see as a huge opportunity is to direct that money to more sustainable transport options. And by that I mean flipping the ratio of money that we spend on roads versus rail, so sending more of it to public transport infrastructure so more people in the outer suburbs can have other ways of getting around other than just their car, or if they don't have a car, they don't have many options at all. But also changing our transport system so it's run with renewable powered electric vehicles. And I'm not talking about Teslas, I mean renewable powered electric buses, trains and trams, which have been electric for some time. And what's really great is we're already starting to see some of those things happen. So in Sydney, I believe the North West Metro project is powered by a solar plant up in Beryl. In Melbourne, our trams are now powered by solar plants in the north of the state. There's an electric bus manufacturing facility in South Australia which is located basically where car manufacturing closed down, so in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, and they've started a new business which is building electric buses. But unfortunately, Australian states, while they might be piloting one or two, they really need to start thinking bigger in order to support those new industries. And what's great is that we can do all of this and we can have more jobs, because studies of building roads versus rail has shown that for every dollar spent you get more jobs out of building new rail as compared to building new highways. We can support new local manufacturing industries that are actually clean and helping to drive the transition. Those industries are already sort of blossoming and we can really help them. But even better, we can clean up our air, we can make our cities nicer places to live, we can make it easier to get around, and we can provide people who live in the outer suburbs with low-cost access, especially people who might not be able to drive for various reasons, low-cost access to cultural activities, employment, education. So when I think about the idea of Green New Deal, I just see a huge opportunity if we really go for it. And, like you can do that in transport, you could do that in electricity too, and in other sectors of the economy. So, yeah, it sounds like a pretty good deal to me.
Thanks, Petra. And the final speaker on the panel is David Shoebridge, who needs a little introduction, but I will remind people that at the last state election, David did campaign very heavily on the just transition, and he is quite well known for comprehensive and radical thinking. And for those of you who've read his Greens manifesto, for the many, not the few, for the planet, not for profit. But I'll give you David now. Thank you.
Thanks all. You stole pretty much half my speech there, so thanks. Get this sorted. Well, first of all, it's terrific to see so many people here on a Saturday talking about transformative politics, talking about Green's New Deal, particularly on such a gorgeous day. On my way here, I just wanted to do circles on the way here before I came in, because we're having some sort of gorgeous, almost summery weather in the middle of winter. And it's kind of, as Greens MP, you enjoy the moment, but are deeply, deeply anxious about what it means for us, what it means for our climate. But anyhow, thank you all for coming today and gathering here today as we do on Gadigal land. And I wanted to start by acknowledging this as Gadigal land, and start by acknowledging that the institution I'm a part of, the New South Wales Parliament, which many of you sent me to, is part of this continuing decolonising brutal institution against First Nations peoples on this continent. And when we're talking about Green New Deal, and I stand here at the beginning of my contribution and acknowledge it's on Gadigal land, I think we must acknowledge that a core part of any Green New Deal must be a decolonising agenda, and we need to put that square and centre in the work we do. I really appreciate the contribution of my two colleagues before this, and Petra, perhaps I'll get you one of my favourite little acknowledged political posters that you'll see all around the state at any given point. Councils are particularly big on this particular statement. It's an orange poster with black writing on it, and it just says "End roadwork." I really like that one. So Green New Deal. What is a Green New Deal? Some people in Australian politics reject it on the idea that it's some sort of US import. And it harkens back to that kind of 1930s US political agenda to respond to the Great Depression and the collapse of capitalism at the time. And say, well, we should reject that because it's got a US kind of focus. Other people say, well, there's the AOC kind of Green New Deal over there, and that's not transformative enough. And then somebody else has a new, other version of Green New Deal over here, and that's not transformative enough. And there's it's a contested place. What is the Green New Deal? Some people in the ALP will say we can't have a Green New Deal in Australia because it starts with green. And some people in the Greens say, well, if we push for a Green New Deal, it'll be associated with the Greens and maybe we won't get massive buy-in because it'll be marginalised about being a Greens New Deal. And there's a little bit of truth in all of those. But there's also one big truth that I think puts paid to all of those arguments, which is when you're talking to people in the progressive side of politics about a transformative agenda, the one tag that I think we can rally around in one way or another, the one tag that's out there as this possible transformative agenda, I think is a Green New Deal. And I think we should own it. We should make it our Green New Deal. We should identify how genuinely it can be a genuinely transformative Green New Deal, and we should just get on and campaign for it. That's my very strong view. But if we're just going to have a Green New Deal that talks about decarbonising the economy, we're not going to inspire enough. If we just have a Green New Deal that talks about decommodifying the economy, we're not going to get enough people on board. If we just have a Green New Deal that talks about reunionising, we're not going to get enough buy-in. We need an inspiring overall picture for politics. That's what we fundamentally need, that inspiring overall picture that reminds people that when we come together, we can not only save the environmental future of this planet, but we can, in doing that, make it a vastly better place for all of us to live in. I cannot but understand how the progressive side of politics has lost a national debate in the last few federal elections to a coalition government whose vision for the future is the further despoiling of our environment, blindness to the climate destruction that we're handing to our kids and our grandkids, committed to insecure work, to further empowering corporations and continuing to drive freeways through our major cities. Now that's their agenda, but somehow or other they won the last federal election, and somehow or other they managed to scrape in by the skin of their teeth at the state election as well. Yet our vision, and I think it's our collective vision, is for secure jobs for everybody. It's for actually tackling the emerging climate disaster, addressing climate change so that we can actually have not just save koalas and forests and all of the beautiful parts, sentient parts of this planet that we share it with, but also so our kids can have a secure economic future and social future, and our societies will stay together. We have an image for where instead of having to pay for a private car with the insurance and the risk and the stress of traffic, you might just be able to walk 5 minutes down the street and jump on some nice, clean, green public transport. Our vision is so much more inspiring and so much more positive, yet we kind of keep missing and failing to win the levers of power at a federal or a state level. And I think we should reflect on why that is. Now, I'll say for myself, when I reflect on the federal election and I reflect on what the ALP did in the federal election. The lesson that Albo and others have taken from the federal election is that they should be less progressive, put less emphasis on the environment, run away from any kind of structural change to the tax or the economic system, and become even more a coalition-light version. I can't imagine a worse lesson from the federal election than that. Because if you're trying to persuade somebody in regional Queensland to vote for the ALP, and they're concerned about the future of their kids, they're concerned about their job, they're concerned about their town, they're concerned about their water supply, and you say to them, well, we're a bit concerned about the environment, and we're going to worry about the environment a little bit, kind of, and we're a bit concerned about your jobs, and we're kind of going to worry about your jobs a little bit, and we don't really want to take on these vested interests over here, so will you vote for us, please? It's not really a persuasive pitch, is it? Yet that was really the ALP's pitch. When they were talking to Metro voters in Brisbane or Sydney, they were kind of saying they were sort of supporting climate change, addressing climate change, and kind of anti-coal. When they're out in regional New South Wales and regional Queensland, they were saying they were kind of for coal. And people aren't mugs. People aren't stupid. And they actually want politicians to stand for something. And as vile as the coalition's agenda was, they said out and loud, we're standing for coal jobs. We're going to support coal jobs. And that's what we stand for. And people like politicians to stand for something, to unambiguously stand for something. I mean, what the coalition is standing for is unambiguously awful, planet-killing, anti-people, anti-environment, but at least they kind of stood for something in the last federal election. So if we're going to actually persuade the majority of people to come and stand with us and vote with our side of politics, we need to stand for something unambiguously, and we need to inspire people on that agenda. And that is why I think the concept of crafting a Greens New Deal that stands unambiguously for both people and the planet, and we don't retreat in the face of the inevitable attacks we're going to get from corporate Australia, from the right wing of the ALP and from the coalition, but we unambiguously stand for it, I'm quite certain that's not just in our electoral interest, but it's the only way we're going to get a mass movement that forces parliaments to come on board and actually put in place the architecture for that kind of transformation that's needed. And to answer Boris's point about, well, it's one thing to have a kind of series of high-level goals. How do you actually make that practical and real for people's life? And I think it is getting that mixture of a inspiring, transformative agenda, but together with some very real, perhaps concrete is the wrong word, some very real positive elements, transformative elements that people can understand. And that's why I think some of the programs we took to the last state election kind of bridge that gap a little. One of those ones that I thought was one of the most, the most cut through, if only we'd had more than just the Newcastle Herald putting on its front page, but one of the most cut through agendas we had was this Transforming Communities program, which when we're looking at the next 10 years of fossil fuel wealth, and Boris gave us some of those figures, 60 odd billion dollars a year in coal exports, 20 to 30 billion dollars a year in gas exports. There's actual wealth being generated by the fossil fuel industry at the moment. We have 10 years to use that wealth to actually transform our economy out of the fossil fuel economy, out of the fossil fuel addiction. And so one of the programs we said was 20% of all coal royalties that are generated in New South Wales need to be reinvested in the communities that dig up the coal and generate that wealth over the next decade to build the public TAFE, to seed the new horticultural industries, to actually repair the landscape and to rebuild economy. So as we transition out of coal over the next 10 years, we bring those communities along with them, and the wealth that they generate transforms their community and builds the jobs and builds the infrastructure going forward. That's about $1.8 billion that we could direct to those coal communities. And go and speak to those communities and tell them how the wealth they are generating will actually build their post-fossil fuel future. A very practical and real transformative agenda. And when it comes to dealing with the obscene carbon footprint of our stationary energy, the solution for that is mass public investment in publicly owned and publicly run renewable energy. And doing that through a vehicle like Power New South Wales, where we actually decommodify, if you like, electricity. Now, one of the arguments against renewable energy that's being run, bizarrely, being run by corporate Australia at the moment is they're horrified that at different points over the last 12 months, there's been so much renewable energy produced in South Australia that it's actually been sold for nothing. It's being given away because the marginal cost of producing it is next to zero. So much renewable energy is being produced that it's flooding the market and they're actually getting no economic return for it. Now, for corporate interests, that is a disaster. For a capitalist economy, producing a key need for nothing is like a short run to economic collapse. It just doesn't fit in a capitalist economy. Producing power for nothing is actually going to destroy ongoing economic activity if our model is entirely a capitalist economy. It's a disaster, which is why we can't rely upon the market to transform us to a renewable energy future. It's why we need it to be publicly owned. It's why we need it when it's generating profits to return those profits to the public. And when it's producing power for nothing, we can actually celebrate it. We can actually celebrate it and not fear about the economic damage that free power will do to a society. Because that's actually the arguments, the discussions in boardrooms at the moment, is the economic damage of next to free power. It's an extraordinary proposition. It shows how skewed our political and our economic discussions are at the moment. Time's up. So to sum up, if someone doesn't ask a question about jobs guarantee and UBI in the course of this discussion, I'm just going to leave the stage at some point. So I think we need to discuss those other kind of elements of a transformative agenda. But I kind of agree with Boris's propositions and I kind of disagree. I agree to the extent we need to put a series of more than just broad transformative statements, but a series of very detailed, specific things that are going to make people realise that this transformation is doable. It's super possible and it's going to make their lives better. And we need to articulate that more clearly. Because I have no doubt that that's what it will do. It'll make everybody's life better. But we need to articulate that. And that's whether that's with that sort of transformative environmental trust agenda where we take coal royalties and we spend it directly in people's communities, or it's talking about 100% publicly owned renewable power, which is cheaper power, much cheaper power, taking the corporate retailers out. Those kind of very specific identifiable projects are essential. But I think over and above that is the need to actually own this stuff. To accept that our job, political job, is to inspire people, to make them believe that it's possible, and to win those arguments that we have been losing to a set of people whose solutions are so appalling. Like the coalition solutions are so appalling. I think actually owning the Green New Deal, not just being the Greens New Deal, but a broader left-wing progressive Green New Deal, making it our Green New Deal and not some sort of Labor light version is going to be crucial. And I think we've got about 12 months to do that. Thanks very much.
Okay. David, you talked about electricity being zero, and I understand that that has happened in South Australia and I think in New South Wales. But the electricity is being produced by private industry, those wind turbines, and they've invested a lot of money into building those. So how can they sell their electricity for no profit at all?
Not just climate action, we need to have climate justice. And clearly for those communities and the workers affected by phasing out the dirty fossil fuel industries do need justice, and that's something we all have to work a lot better on. But I also have a couple of other challenges in terms of Greens policy. we have a net zero emissions by 2040. I've recently heard a talk at a renewable energy conference by Christine Milne. Her talk was called Drop the Net. And I thought, is that a spelling mistake? Maybe she means to talk about dropping the debt, but we've heard that phrase so often. But she did mean drop the net from greenhouse gas emissions. We really have to look at doing away with emissions completely, and our policy by 2040 needs to be not just carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide equivalent, including all those dirty greenhouse gases. So that's a challenge I'd ask if we think that is feasible for the Greens to run that policy. And one more challenge is the issue of growth. Some people say we can have sustainable growth. Obviously we can grow more trees and maybe that's sustainable to have growth, but we can't do it infinitely. And infinite growth on a finite planet is clearly impossible. So how do we address that challenge of growth, whether we do away with it completely or not?
Thanks very much, Bill. I'll take one more, right up the back in the back corner. Evan.
Hi, thanks to the speakers first and foremost. It's great to have these kinds of discussions. I can remember hearing about Green New Deal ages ago from the Nanny actually the things early 2010, so it's good to see that it's in a different forum. I suppose a few questions. First, there's been a lot of responses from First Nations people in the US through the Red New Deal, recognising the limitations of what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is arguing, particularly given she's a supporter of nuclear. So I was wondering what people's views on the Red New Deal and how we can extend the idea of the Green New Deal in Australia. Next thought was the fact that a lot of the discussion around the Green New Deal, which seems to be a framework of how we can understand society and how we can change society on the whole as opposed to just the environment, a lot of that is included having to do away with cap and trade mechanisms and recognising that they don't work. The Greens have in the past, like in 2010, made cap and trade, also known as the carbon tax, a really large policy of ours, something that's actually failed in large part of Europe. Is this something I'd throw open to the floor as much to the speakers? If it's important in order to get our Green New Deal that we do away with our commitment to cap and trade, and I support doing away with the cap and trade mechanisms, are we happy to do that? The next bit, it says Green New Deal, but who do we want that deal with? Is this something that we think is a debate that needs to be just in Parliament? How can we bring that out into the people? Because it can't just be motions, even though it's great to see Parliament's discussing this. And the last one is, what do we think the difference is between job guarantee and green jobs? Because it's one thing to say that miners in one specific area have access so they can transfer over to green manufacturing. It's another thing to say we all need access to a job guarantee. Because if it's a Green New Deal, we're talking about reshaping the economy, reshaping the world. So why are we talking about a job guarantee for everyone?
Well, there's a lot obviously in those questions that come, so I'm just going to pass the microphone along the table for responses. Boris, did you want to start?
Well, a couple of questions are directly to David, but I'll respond to the couple of the final questions asked. I'm personally opposed to a universal basic income. I think it's very divisive. It can't be sustained financially. Universal is the key. There's a difference between basic income for the lowest 30 to 40% of the population who desperately need an improvement in their income to just get essentials, but universal is quite different. It's inadequate as probably, if you want to read the details, I've got a chapter devoted to the UBI and going through what are the pros and what are the cons against it. I'm personally in favour of universal basic services, and I retain the universal because I'm in agreement with David that if you want a Green New Deal that is a broad political agenda and most appealing to a wider section of the population, then you have to make it universal. That is, you have to make it clear to the populace, to the electorate, that they are going to get essential health, education, public transport, other services, libraries, you name it, sorry? NBN, not a Mickey Mouse Turnbull NBN, which can't even show an Indigenous film tonight, earlier in the session. But they are part of the ingredients of what a universal service thing. It's much cheaper than a UBI, and it is much more far-reaching. I'm also a very strong supporter of the guaranteed wage or a job, but I'm not in favour of the guaranteed job that's proposed by AOC and the others in the US, which favours a guaranteed government job, provided job, at $15 an hour, which is totally inadequate in terms of the cost of living. I'm in favour of a voluntary, joining a voluntary guaranteed job, because people think it's a compulsory thing that you have to join, and you have to make it very clear that it's a voluntary option, and to pay award wages of the type of jobs that people are going to take up. And they can take it at either full-time or at a fractional appointment, so that they can have a decision about how they want to balance their own personal lives. And then you can devolve that to greater democratic, decentralised allocation of the jobs by communities. We had a touch of that decades ago when you had the Whitlam government local community program, which was closed down by Fraser immediately, because it devolved a lot of decision making about what kind of jobs, what kind of services and facilities communities wanted in their local areas, whether they were in big cities or in regional towns. So there are some of the things that I would favour.
I was just going to talk about two things. One was the question about zero cost renewable energy. How does that work? I used to work for a wind farm company, and there's any number of different ways that renewable energy companies sell their power. One of the more common ways is through sort of long-term agreements to provide a certain amount of power over a number of years, and the best example is in the ACT, where they essentially ran what they called reverse auctions for renewable energy. So that meant that renewable energy companies competed to provide electricity for the lowest possible price, and so through that policy, the ACT basically set new record lows for power prices year in, year out, and the trade-off for the renewable energy companies that won those contracts was a sort of guaranteed price over a long period of time. So, which means that they can balance out the times when there is I don't want to get into describing how the electricity market works, but it means that they can balance out the low and the high prices over time on the market through these longer term contracts with governments. But those longer term contracts mean that people in the ACT benefit from that through cheaper electricity prices. The net zero, drop the net, I completely agree. I work for a NGO which its mission statement is to get to net zero emissions, and I hate explaining the net bit. And how I try and do that is basically, what that means is we try and get as close to zero emissions as possible, and then we make up for the difference. Because I think the net bit is also super dangerous, because certain modelling will allow quite a large amount of continued emissions from fossil fuels, and then requiring a huge amount of new vegetation, for example, to be planted. And we know that the impacts of climate change means you can't rely on land to basically capture emissions for certain for a long period of time, because we know we have increased, more frequent fires, drought. All these things affect the ability of land to draw down emissions. So I completely agree, let's drop the net.
Well, I won't reverse what Boris and Petra have said about answering certain of those questions, but the issue about $0 wholesale price for renewable energy, you see, within a capitalist marketplace, that's seen as a disaster. And in fact, Abigail Boyd and I recently went on a bit of a tour between Wales and Port Augusta and looked at all of those renewable energy projects down there. And they're both inspiring and troubling at the same time. They're inspiring because there's a massive amount of renewable energy being built. And if we build an interconnector there, which we need, between South Australia and New South Wales, we will open up a whole chunk of some of the best solar real estate on the planet to major renewable energy projects. And it's an awesome kind of thought that with that interconnector coming, hopefully publicly owned, publicly built interconnector, we can literally open up everywhere from the Hay Plains all the way across to South Australia for this extraordinary amount of renewable energy projects. But at the moment, it's being built at the lowest possible cost per unit, which means ununionised subcontractors, really high levels of injuries on what should be a pretty extraordinarily safe construction project. And in many cases, First Nations people's been entirely cut out of the deal entirely. You know, hundreds of hectares of land in very remote Australia delivering nothing for First Nations peoples. So if we're talking about a Green New Deal, yeah, there's inspiring elements about what's being built, the sheer scale of those projects. But we need to talk about it as a whole package. It needs to be constructed using people who we pay and respect. I would have thought on minimum union award rates or EBAs. The Indigenous people, First Nations peoples, need to get an ongoing return and be part of those projects. And there's a couple of those projects that are actually doing that now and engaging with First Nations peoples. But for me, the answer to much of that is ensuring that the next wave of investment we get in renewable energy, if we do open up that interconnector, is in publicly owned, publicly built, in partnership with First Nations peoples. Imagine that as the kind of projects that's delivering our zero cost. Because corporate Australia, they see zero cost energy as a disaster. But if it's publicly owned and we're producing zero cost energy, well, that's just an amazing win for everybody. But you can't have a Green New Deal if First Nations peoples from across the planet are being marginalised in that process. And in fact, you know, there was some discussion in that first session about there's a kind of genocidal tendency to some of the parts of the environment movement where they see people as the problem. And population is the problem, people is the problem, identifying it as a contest between people and the environment. And I personally reject that concept. I mean, obviously we need to control the population on the planet, but unless we're actually engaging in a genuine partnership between people and the planet, and we bring people on board, and we don't identify First Nations peoples or other people from developing countries as the problem, but indeed we should see a Green New Deal as delivering for them fundamentally, I think we're going to have very fraught political discussion over the next 10 to 20 years as the environmental crisis becomes even tougher. And those really hard decisions need to be made. But I think it starts with, I would hope, an acknowledged part of the Green New Deal acknowledgement is there will be revenue sharing, there will be sovereignty, and there will be economic returns for First Nations peoples in this country.
We do have to have much more serious thinking about what the economy is, who it serves, who owns it, and how do we pay things, which really means directing resources, and that's mostly wages, towards projects that are pro-environmental for the long term. Boris asked a tough question: how do the Greens mean to drive this type of transition? And a lot of that relies on dirty industries being taxed more, when in fact we want those dirty industries ultimately to close ASAP. So, I think as a party we need to engage much more seriously in fundamental questions of economics, not market economics as such, but we can't just make the market go away. Fundamental economic questions exist whether we've got a capitalist system or something heading towards being better than that. So I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. Otherwise, it's about saying to people, look at all of the different types of jobs, all the way from much better paid childcare, better paid and better ratios for elder care, across to the enormous amount of earth repair jobs that we need right across the country if we're to take any of this seriously. And Petra makes a very good point. As climate change accelerates, and it is obviously accelerating rapidly right now today, the ability of natural systems to help us with projects like reforestation are actually going to rapidly decline, or take a lot more human power to look after tree plantings, etc., etc., etc. We face radical uncertainty around all natural systems as we go forward. It's a great opportunity for jobs. We're going to need a lot more of them, but we're not really tying it all together yet, I don't think, whether in terms of really understanding how it will work and then describing that to people as the absolutely necessary route down which we must go. You know, the Liberal Party has no plan for this, the Labor Party has no plan for this. We've got some ideas towards a plan, we've got a lot of work to do as a party.
Thank you. And yes.
One for me on that. I do a radio program about this, and I've been interviewing people about this, and I haven't been able to get a good answer on what the Green New Deal should be. And I've been talking to unions later, and they all use this phrase, oh, we need a bit more flesh on the bones. So, I'm very glad that the Greens have an education group. I don't know you had that, but I would like more sessions like this, like a whole weekend on this session, for example, just a whole weekend on this issue. We've talked about people's assemblies, the Extinction Rebellion talked about people's assemblies, to cut through this professionalisation of everything and a need for everything, so that you get more brain power into every issue. And I remember the Vietnam era, we had teach-ins at the university because it was an emergency. It literally was an emergency. People were dying that we knew. And so we went every weekend, every night we were there on teach-ins. And I think the Greens should perhaps just start leading with more teach-ins. And what's your answer to that?
Just one more, James, just behind Bruce. Yes, there.
Yeah, I think the other reason the Green New Deal discussion is important, obviously, within the first session is that we're in a context where post the federal election was quite a wake-up call around how we talk about climate action. If you look at what happened in coal mining areas in the Hunter and in Queensland and so on, we thought this was going to be the climate election. What we actually had was the far-right Hansonites, Morrison benefiting because people actually couldn't see how climate change was going to help, how action on climate change was going to help them. We're seeing it's a threat to jobs, a threat to communities, and so on. And I think that's the benefit of it. It actually gives us a way of starting to be able to explain how a climate transition can actually be done in the interest of ordinary people and the working class, across the country, how it's going to benefit communities. But the other thing that's important is that we need to connect this to the new climate movement which is emerging, and hasn't been exploding over the past few months. I think in that respect, I think there's two kind of issues I wanted to raise. One is with the September 20 climate strike. I mean, it's been initiated by high school students, but I think they have started to put the issue of just transition and jobs much more at the centre of what they're talking about this time in response to the election. And I think that's something that we need to seize on and make sure that we get the biggest turnout we can to support them from workplaces, from trade unions, to actually inject that politics and make it clear that we're actually trying to build a climate movement which is going to fight for jobs, and which is actually going to be something which is talking about solutions in the interests of ordinary people. Because, as we know, with what happened in the election, there is still an image problem that people don't understand how that can actually be the case. So I think we should all do what we can to do that for the September 20 climate strike. I think the other challenge we have in New South Wales in the next few years is actually about the Liddell Power Station, what's going to happen with those immediate prospects of closures. We've now had, you've got Angus Taylor disgracefully saying that he wants to extend the life of this power station, maybe even put in some government money to keep it going as long as possible, to keep polluting as much as it kind of can. And that's a challenge for us. How are we actually going to both fight to make sure that the thing is closed as soon as possible and that there's a plan for closing all the others as well, but also about how we're going to make it clear that we don't just talk about jobs, we're actually going to be there fighting for those communities. We're going to make a point about fighting through that transition to make sure that it's done in such a way that the community benefits. And that's something which will be on the agenda very shortly. They're saying now 2023, but that's something we need to start organising around as well.
Okay. And there's a lot in those questions, and once again, I'll ask for reasonably quick responses from the people on the panel. Barbara. Well, you want to start the other end?
It's not a Petro.
Start with Petro.
I can say it if you
Oh,
want.
yeah, all right.
There's a lot of nonsense being spoken about the Dell. In fact, just about 2 days ago, the Federal Electricity Oversight Body with AEMO put out a statement about the Dell that said, if nothing else happens, we build no more renewable energy, we don't get any of the interconnectors working, that there will be 12 months where there's a tiny potential shortfall for electricity in New South Wales when the Dell shuts down. And then Snowy Hydro 2.0 will come back on and that will all be gone. The right of politics catastrophised that and said, oh my God, we're going to have power blackouts in 2024. But when you read the report very clearly, even with our current totally dysfunctional policy settings in place, it's likely we won't get to that point because the amount of renewable energy being built under the current system is probably going to largely cover the gap for the Dell. And we're also talking about, when we're talking about power shortages or power blackouts, we're talking about maybe 3 days a year in peak summertime demand for a few afternoons. And there's other ways of addressing that even without further major investment in terms of demand management and the like in those periods. So yes, we need a vastly better market. Yes, we need a vastly better electricity supply, significantly more renewable energy, but there's a lot of catastrophising about Liddell for a purpose, you know. That's a political purpose, but there's no actual reality to it. The idea about young people taking the lead on climate change and young people coming out and just sort of kind of stepping outside of politics and saying, well, bugger you, we're going to go on the streets and demand climate justice, is pretty inspiring in many ways, but it's also a statement about where politics is at the moment. And, you know, why is it being led by high school students? Well, one of the reasons I'd say it's been led by high school students is because uni students already have to have 3 jobs, are facing an incredible amount of debt, and no longer have the time or the energy to do the kind of political activism that was being done 20 or 30 years ago. You know, neoliberal economy has destroyed activism at the university level, and so it's shifted down a generation to high school, who thankfully are much better connected with social media now and are actually stepping up, so God bless them. I have to go to a 21st tonight. I haven't gone to one of those for a number of years. I was thinking about, you know, why young people are disengaged with politics, and I was thinking about, you know, what are people thinking about at the 21st? And I thought, well, maybe I could shave off the grey beard, put on some makeup, because it's the theme is mythical creatures. And I thought I could go as a 30-year-old with a secure job in a stable accommodation with a government that's actually got the interest of me for climate change going forward. That'll be the mythical creature I'll go in tonight.
I don't know that I can add to that. The renewable energy and blackouts thing, Grattan has this wonderful graph that they did. There's not a lot of great stuff from Grattan on energy, but they did do this one great graph where they showed frequency of blackouts over time, and it's constant, if not getting better. And they showed media reporting on reliability, and media reporting goes like this. After the 2016 South Australian blackout. And I grew up in South Australia, and I remember having blackouts all the time, and there was no renewable energy. So I just always think it's crazy. But the good thing is that people in South Australia know that that's crazy too. They keep polling South Australians to find out whether or not they believe any of this. And South Australians consistently say they believe that the cause of power price rises and the cause of electricity problems in their state is the privatisation of the electricity network. Consistently.
I'm just going to finish with a couple of heretical words about the Greens focusing too much on energy.
Well, everyone.
Electricity is only a small part of the problem, a very important part, but what you need to do, in my opinion, is focus more on the type of issues that are going to come forward in the next 5 years or so, and unless you prepare for those issues in terms of how you organise the economy and social services and how we relate to what kind of export industries and import, you're not going to get too far, because the other problem is, don't talk about the capitalist class as some homogenous entity. They're not. The vast majority of capitalists are happy to live with green, renewable energy. There are very powerful fossil fuel lobbies that are going to resist this to the bitter end. We can't underestimate them. But let's also not think that the market is going to be unanimously for fossil fuels. They're not. The key policy-making institutions globally have already shifted, but the key energy providers in certain areas haven't. The final word is, there is no such thing as a zero marginal cost industry or commodity. And I discuss this in the book, but this goes for energy as well. The problem for many people, they still are not able to grasp the difference between the software and the hardware. You can have renewable energy in this country right across, 100%, but you still have to have the hardware in terms of the panels or the electronic equipment or the cement and the rare metals that are a part of that whole renewable industry, and they have an inbuilt carbon component and a non-carbon component. And until we grasp that, the key factor is, will the cost of producing the hardware outweigh the benefits of the renewable energy that flows? And at the moment we're heading in that direction. But let's not put all our eggs, I'm not saying all of you do that, but there is too much discussion about Liddell as a dinosaur, right? You have to make sure it doesn't get renewed. But there are so many other issues in Australia that you need to develop plans for. You can't be caught with your pants down in the next, before the next election. You've got to start thinking now, what is your policy program, both state level and nationally? That's what I'm going to finish. Good luck anyway on it.
All right, we've both had sobering and inspiring words this afternoon. I just want to alert Greens members here. The Greens Political Education Trust will be putting a late proposal to the State Delegates Council tomorrow that the Greens support the September 20 student strike that people have talked about this afternoon. And as far as I can tell, just by sampling opinion, nobody here would oppose that. So I'm hopeful.
Put it to the vote now. Put it to the floor.
All right, those of you who think the Greens should support the September 20 workout, all those in, yeah, I thought so. Thank you very much for that. And can we just have one more burst of applause for the great panel? Thank you. And Boris's book, for those of you who want to do some homework, is up here as well. Thank you.